Okay, great. Let's start. Hi, everyone. I'm Daly. I'm a staff technologist at the EFF, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel conversation. So this is another installment of our At Home with EFF series that we kicked off last year during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. We did a Pride Month version last year, which is recorded on our Twitch channel. You can go watch it there. And I'm happy to be doing it again this year. We're going to have about half an hour of conversation with our guests, and then we'll have a Q&A portion later. So wherever you're watching from, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll gather them up and then we'll talk about them later. Speaking of our guests, it's an honor to be in conversation with Moses Moon, aka thotscholar, Chelsea Manning, hello, Hadi, Damien, and Ian Coldwater. So great to see all of your faces.
Hey, great to see you too.
So I'd like to give you all a chance to introduce yourselves to our virtual audiences spread out across the internet right now. Who you are, what you're up to, etc. Moses, do you want to kick us off?
Oh, I have to go first? Okay. I am currently writing a book and several other things. I just was published in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. I did the introduction for their symposium on sex work politics and a bunch of other things. I should stop telling people this. I was told to stop saying this, but I'm mostly on Twitter. Twitter is my main platform. I didn't seek to really build a platform per se, but it just kind of happened and it just kind of snowballed or whatever. But mostly I write. I also draw. I used to sing. So I'm an all-around artiste, but mostly I like creating theory or critiquing or whatever. So that's basically what I do. I focus on sex work politics, bisexuality, transgenderism, and trans politics, queer politics, race politics, and sex and gender and all of that good stuff.
Awesome. Happy to have you here. Chelsea, would you like to go next?
Sure. I am a Twitch streamer, and I am producing a YouTube. I'm producing YouTube video series on science and technology, cryptocurrency, and artificial intelligence are the first two topics that I'm doing a series on. I'm XYChelsea87 on Twitch. I am XYChelsea on YouTube, and I am my Patreon is patreon.com/XYChelsea. That is my main source of income. I do security consulting as well. But I am mostly transitioning towards doing more and more content production full time.
Awesome.
And I mostly talk about science and technology, security, things like that. Not known for anything else.
That's it.
That's
it. Ian, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ian Coldwater. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a software architect doing security for a company that does things. I also help run SIG security for the Kubernetes project, which is a small open source project that nobody ever uses. I am Ian Coldwater on Twitter. And yeah, I think that's what I got to say.
Kubernetes is a pretty small project. I think it's new, upcoming.
Nobody's ever heard of it.
A couple users, yeah. Great, thank you. Hadi, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted.
Hi, so my name is Hadi Damien. I am based in Beirut, the initiator of Beirut Pride and currently co-president of InterPride, the structure that brings together all pride organizations in the world. Very excited to be here with you. Talking about digital civil rights is very important, and let's get this started.
Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, we're going to do like a bit of a moderated discussion for the first half hour or so, and then we'll have a Q&A later. But kicking off with that, I think I might want to start asking you all some questions, like just generally to the group first. Feel free to jump in as you wish if you feel so compelled. And then maybe we can go a little more pointed and I'll like pinpoint a couple of you individually. But starting off, at the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're focused on protecting digital civil liberties of internet citizens, right? So I'm curious to hear what you all think about how the fight for protecting those rights impacts LGBTQIA plus people differently, or how that conversation shifts a little bit from that perspective. Anyone can feel free to jump in. That's a broad question to the group.
All right, sorry. So I'm just gonna go because nobody's answering anything. So I'm just gonna go. All right, cool. So basically, the issue. I mean, whenever it comes to like queer and trans issues and electronics, I usually think of I usually have to like range the like. I mean, I do threat modeling, right? So it's you have to sort of threat model between the different levels of who a person is and what their threat and what threats they're facing. So you know, like a young queer or trans person who's just trying to figure out who they are, for instance, needs to protect, you know, sometimes needs to protect their identities from their family. And so their threat group is like their family. And then you move up into like, you know, there are people who are activists, like in countries where it's still illegal to be queer or trans. And they face a different threat model. Then there's like sex work that has a whole different threat model. So, you know, there's a sort of like the whole intersectionality of all of these different, you know, LGBTQ people in different spaces have different threats that they face. And one of the things that that I usually focus on is like identifying which threats they face and what means to like you know, what methods are practical and available, you know, that doesn't impact your daily life. Like you can't protect yourself from everything, but how do you protect yourself, you know, and still be able to live, you know, an improved life. So like, you know, what issue, I mean, it's a broad question because like there's just so many different there's so many different levels of risk involved.
Yep. And if I may step in here, you know, it's a very porous border, the one between the online world and away from the keyboard. And you know, internet is quite impactful for our work. You know, it is crucial to connect. It's crucial to it's for us to make out whatever we wish to make out from it. You know, it makes knowledge more accessible. So today we really have no excuse not to tap into the knowledge that many people have created before us. For example, Chelsea just spoke about being safe online and how we have to do it. So today in spaces where LGBTQ plus status is criminalized, we don't really have to invent the wheel. We can simply tap into what already has been happening and build on it. And this is precisely what we do. You know, we develop our connections, especially with people going through what we are going through. So this, when we compound the resources, we can generate a better impact when we really want to generate better impact and improve people's realities together. So yeah, these are my 2 cents here. And actually, to be even more practical and concrete, you know, last year, Internet enabled InterPride and ECOWA to organize the massive Global Pride in June 2020. And now, during the upcoming World Pride in Copenhagen, Internet will enable us to broadcast tons of material and sessions all over the Internet, all over the world. So people who cannot travel because of COVID restrictions and COVID effects can actively still participate. And even during Pride, Internet has enabled us to connect with people who started their child pride. So with people who have worked on decriminalization of LGBT status in the world and in other countries. So it's quite a massive impact.
Yeah, you both touched on a couple of good like spring points from there, like talking about how there is no one answer, there's no one like point of view, right? Just like when it comes to talking about such a broad community, especially internationally speaking, and also like how it impacts our material realities. So speaking of which, I think it's really easy for people like activists and people that are advocating for rights online to miss like those material impacts that that policies and internet legislations or just like the infrastructure the internet has on our communities in real life, away from keyboard, like. And I'm curious how internet life or policy regulation infrastructure has impacted your work. And actually, just to single you out, Moses, you've been a real like thinker in this space. I think like before it was cool, like the way you have talked about like platform censorship and content moderation and how these things like unequally enforced hit certain like specific communities hardest.
Yeah, so I was just about to jump in, but I've been talking a lot. I've been reading a lot about. That's why I haven't really been on Twitter, because I've been just reading. I've been reading about surveillance and about like there's this lack of, and I don't know if anybody follows like what's going on in academia or whatever, but there's like there's a paper I'm reading. It's called "Challenging the Invisibility of Sex Work in Digital Labor Politics." A lot of the time when people do talk about digital labor, they don't really mention sex work. And when people talk about sex work, I wrote about this in Peep Show magazine. And I was argued down on Twitter about this, that there's this thread in sex work politics, or in that arena on Twitter, that anyone who works online is automatically privileged. And I've kind of like dissected the language of privilege and how it's really not effective in describing some of our, as some people would say, intersections or, whatever. I've been thinking about like cyber sex work and how the majority of the industry utilizes the internet in some way, shape, or form. And yet we still have uneven access to the internet. Like in my area, I live on the south side of Chicago, and our internet like is sometimes like not as good, or it's out, or different things like that. And whatever, it's because of the area that I live in, because the area that I live in is majority Black. And this happens in other in indigenous areas and everything like that, and it happens in urban spaces. And in actuality, like a lot of the time when we focus on like the digital divide, we focus on like urban versus rural, when if you look at it all broadly, like all together, poor white people who live in rural, I hate this word, rural and urban areas actually have greater access to internet than their counterparts of non-white counterparts. And so I don't think a lot of people know that, and the digital divide conversation kind of obscures that. And when we talk about digital labor politics, we don't talk about sex work, because the picture of a sex worker in trouble, or survival sex worker, is like a homeless youth, or like it's like the drug user, prostitute. It's not like like the people like. And then the thing is that like online is like almost synonymous with like escorting, which is like a different, like a higher end prostitution. So, or like like OnlyFans and things like that. But there's like a lot of what we would what some people would term lower end or lower class sex workers who are utilizing the internet because it's just like a ubiquitous part of our life, like water and electricity and all these other utilities. And this is why I think that we should take control, or the public should have control over internet access. We should all have internet access. It should be a utility, because we have to use it to fill out job applications. We have to use it to make appointments. We have to use it to do all of these vital things. So why should we have to pay upwards of like 80 to 100 to more to have access to the internet? I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's where it took me.
You're answering that question and a few others I had.
Yeah.
And more, like you touched on, there are a few things in there, like especially like the hierarchy of like privileges that kind of stack up with our access to the internet, or within like sex work, right? Like colloquially in the community, we call this the hierarchy, about like how the stacks of privilege like hit different people. And you've done such amazing work in like talking about how access to internet, or access to platforms on internet, or like the different types of access hits different levels of like the hierarchy in different ways, which is such like an untapped part of the conversation, and important because, as you pointed out, like sex workers built the internet.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real fast and just like point out that, like, you know, one of the things that I've encountered between the discussion between online sex work and street sex work, right, is the fact that street sex work usually ends up using Bitcoin or Venmo or some kind of cashless, you know, method to do payment, as opposed to like paper cash. So like, and that they're like, so like that goes with the same sort of thing, is that even though they may not have internet access, they're still most people are still using these services that are still available on a smartphone.
And if we're talking about the fight for internet freedom and the connections to sex work and to LGBTQIA plus folks anyway, a lot of the time internet policies that come down on queer folks, I'm just going to say as large umbrella term, start out as anti-sex work policies. And so it's important for us to be fighting for the digital rights of sex workers, because that will eventually end up coming down on the rest of us.
Sure.
That's a really good point. It's difficult to, it makes it like sometimes I think more difficult to like narrow the scope of what we're advocating for when we have to realize that it's a vastly intersectional network of issues, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not hypothetical. Like, you know, you see like Apple removed is in the process of removing Grindr, you know, from the App Store.
I mean, they released a statement saying that it's not going to hit Grindr, but the sentiment behind it.
Right. But they're using their leverage. They're using the threat, you know, essentially to basically force Grindr to crack down on people. And they're, you know, like it's a disproportionate amount of power.
Exactly. And that actually is a perfect lead-in, thank you, to my next question I wanted to ask, which is like talking about these sort of big companies that we have that support, so-called support for like pride movements, or like queer LGBTQIA plus friendly movements, especially in the US specific, but then often fail to roll out products like the rainbow-like feature to users in certain countries or areas under the guise of like protecting these people's safety because of where they live in the world. How do you feel about this? Like, what kind of nerve is it hitting? Is this a paternalistic move, or is it protective, or what?
Well, honestly, to be very frank, I really want to hear your feedback and your matter before I speak to it, because this is a very recurrent conversation we have in InterPride and InterPride circles in general. So yeah, so I'm very excited to hear what you think.
It's hard to hear you. I'm sorry.
It is a little difficult to hear.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying that this is a conversation that keeps on coming in Pride circles, in InterPride and other places, and I would love to hear what is your take on this matter. And then I would share things with you, you know, on what is the point of many Pride organizations.
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Please feel free.
Oh, I was gonna say. I think for me, I think a lot of these issues tend to converge at a certain point. Like, it's not just paternalism, but it's specifically, or I guess it's for me, like, and we could talk globally too, but I'm just going to talk about America just so I don't get too, you know, whatever. But and you know, it's in the Americas, you know, we're specifically living under sort of like an you know, like white supremacy or like an anglocracy is what I'm calling it. And basically it all comes back to sex, gender, and race. All of these issues to control people's movement, to control people's body, to control people who are not fully considered people but are considered property, in, you know, the greater sense of the term or the literal sense of the term, depending on, you know, your perspective. And so I think that a lot of this crackdown, it doesn't just have to do with sex work. It has to do with maintaining the anglocracy. And so, and the power and the material things that, you know, and the power that, you know, that these, you know, larger forces hold. And so all of these things come back to, you know, control of the population, control of the citizens, and everything like that. So, you know, they create these laws. Like, you'll see these conversations about overpopulation. You'll see it a lot in that, and all of these things touch on reproductive justice, because when you hear about overpopulation, when they talk about it, what they really mean, and then you can see, is that there are too many non-white people and not the right white, quote unquote, people who are having children. You know what I'm saying? Like they you know, because so many other groups when they come to America were subsumed into, you know, the category of white. That's why I like quoted it, because like there's a lot of people who would come to America and be considered white who aren't considered white in other places. And they're also like, some of them are also part of populations where it's like, we don't really want you having kids. It's like a, you know, a genocide type of, you know, it's like a type of eugenics, you know. So when we hear about overpopulation, we hear that, you know, you're not having enough, you know, we're not having enough kids, and we're not having enough, you know, we're not reproducing enough. And when 2050 comes, there's going to be so many elderly people overtaking youth and everything like that. But in reality, the we, it's just such a very loose we, right? Because like the majority of people in America who are not having a lot of children are white. And so the worry and you know, like the thing that's happening concurrently too is like this control over white women's bodies, because they want, especially cisgender white women specifically, because they want white women to have children. So there's like this push and pull of like, we want more children, and at the same time, oh, but we're overpopulated, you know. And like this, like it's like constant circle.
It is like, it is like a massive overstep, right? To be for these like companies like Facebook or like Apple, as Chelsea mentioned earlier, to take it upon themselves to be like the arbiters of what is morally acceptable, right? Like that's not their position. They're software companies.
This happens with the state too, because like, you know, with law enforcement, because like I had some neighbors across the street, and they were like, I was sitting outside, and then they started like screaming and arguing and whatever, and I guess she hit him, and then he pushed her, and then she was like, I'm gonna call the police on you. So it was a black couple, and I went to see if they were all right, and the guy downstairs was like, oh yeah, they fight like that all the time, just call the police. And I was like, what? No, I'm not doing that. Just like, I just wanted to see if they were all right. And he was like, well, you know, like the police could take care of it because they have guns. And I was like, what are guns supposed, like, they're not so, like, what do guns have to do with this? Is clearly a social workers issue. Like, but we have the police and the state kind of like, we've substituted like therapy and like I said, it's a loose weed. Like there's a substitution, you know, of therapy and social workers and what they're actually supposed to be doing, like arbiters, ombuds, people. And instead you just call the police, and the police are supposed to handle like domestic disputes and all of these other little things. And it's gotten more and more, they've encroached more and more into the home and like these different territories. And it's a control tactic.
And it does like almost seem like there some of these same steps are like running in parallel from like Apple or Facebook or Google or whoever, Visa, MasterCard, different internet infrastructural services that are taking it upon themselves to do the same sorts of controlling measures, which is confusing.
Well, Well, they're doing a lot of that, under pressure because they know they want to self-regulate before Congress steps in, because Congress is constantly threatening. I mean, the federal Congress in the U.S. basically is setting the pace, the agenda here.
Actually, I would like to speak to something that was brought up about social media and platforms censoring, and about their job, whether it is their job to do this. And so, it's quite a delicate thing, because partly it's a private company. So it's like when you're going to a restaurant, if you don't like it, you leave, and it's uncomfortable. But at the same time, when you are this huge company that is so instrumental, and that is beyond a company that has literally been somehow shaping people's lives and interaction, then it is a different story. It's a different discourse. And, well, there is inevitably more radicalization. There is more extremism, and they should be inherently framed. And when we read history, when we go back to see what has been happening before, we understand that what we live is really not new and exceptional. Of course, these are new expressions because of Facebook and so on, but the core is still the same. And the problem with people who want to use a specific compass to say that I'm more moral than you, and I know how people must behave and what should happen, I personally believe that this is a very dangerous thing, because all totalitarian systems and regimes use this discourse in the beginning. We know better. We're working for the best of people, of whatever progress and so on. And we need to acknowledge that when people pull in a certain direction and add more tension, the other party is going to respond the same way. And when it comes to free speech forces us to use our, brain. Like, in the name of free speech, we cannot literally say everything and nothing. We really need to be very responsible, because with all our freedoms comes a great deal of responsibility. However, we can never police or criminalize words. The moment we do so, even for a good cause, we establish a precedent, a very dangerous precedent, that will be used later on against those people that these policies initially sought to protect. So yes, it's a structure, but banning people from social media, or like Chelsea mentioned earlier, for example, having Grindr and Apple reframing a conversation or a specific behavior around sex work or escorting and so on. Like, let's be clear, there are plenty of ways to get around things. But banning people from social media, for example, is definitely not a solution. And I also believe that it's better that hate speech happens publicly, so we can better monitor it rather than cancel it, because when we do so, the hate speech will continue, but you will lose track of it, because it will take place in zones and spaces that are less visible and less accessible to us. So we are only creating further polarization, which leads to very lethal things.
I'm not sure I agree, to be honest. I think that we have seen that deplatforming works. In the last several years, I think you can look at Mr. Milo to see an example of times when deplatforming has actually been quite effective in getting hate speech and open Nazism and that kind of organizing. If you drive it to less visible places, then it actually can make it materially more difficult in a couple of different ways for them to organize. And I'm not sure I think that's entirely bad. I think you're right. It's a hard line to walk because we've seen that, well-intentioned policies can end up coming down on people who they were not originally intended to come down on. But I also think that, like, letting fascists organize in the open, we've seen emboldens them, helps them do more stuff and recruit more people. Putting them into places where they're going to have a hard time talking to people who are not each other, we've seen works. And so it is a hard line.
Yeah. And I think the question really comes down to who does where does that deplatforming come from? Does it come from the state? Does it come from corporations? Does it come from relationships? And or does it come from just sort of like outcry and like, you know, like protest and things like that? So I think that's like that's definitely a debate that has been going on in Western Europe and the United States in particular lately, and I don't think it's landed quite yet, but I tend to agree with Ian on that part. Yeah, you know, if you will give the corporations or the government, you know, this deplatforming power, it may end up, you know, backfiring on, you know, the queer and trans community.
Yeah,
and unrestricted power, that is.
Sure. So, like, you know, we chat amongst ourselves. We have debates with ourselves about what is the best place, or like where should this deplatforming take place? At what level of freedom of speech should be given to digital citizens, right? But that's not how the companies roll it out, right? So, like, Mark Zuckerberg takes it upon himself to make the decisions for us. If you if you had a piece of advice for Mr. Zuckerberg about how to approach these issues, what would it be?
This is supposed to be a serious answer and not like quit your job and fly to Mars or something.
That is a completely
yeah.
valid.
I was completely that was my hesitation too. Same hesitation. Did we lose Moses?
I think they had to step off for a second to
Okay.
take the young one in the back.
Okay.
It happens.
It happens. Yeah, there are people around us. My cat is trying to break into the room as we speak.
But yeah, it's hard because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, depending on CEOs to address these things it's just a terrible model. You know, you're basically depending on the whim of an unelected, unaccountable billionaire to make these decisions, and when they make these decisions, they're unquestioned and far-reaching. So, you know, if I mean, my opinion is the same as Ian's here, which is like, you know, giving them that power and to begin with, just giving somebody like Mark Zuckerberg that amount of power is just like, they shouldn't have that power to begin with. That amount of power, it should be a more diverse, more distributed, debate and discourse, in my opinion. So
there shouldn't be billionaires. Sorry.
I don't know. I'm just taking all of your comments in and stuff like that, because I don't have like full thoughts on this yet, but I will say that there's like this invisible line drawn between quote unquote like fascists and like other entities, other groups, and everything like that. And I don't think that line is a hard line. So I think I liked what Chelsea said about it depends on who's making the policies and who is doing the deplatforming, because honestly, like, it's hard to like, for me, it's hard to kind of like think of these things as separate. Like, a lot of people, they, you know, like, if they're in politics, you know, they're a staunch Democrat or they're Republicans and whatever. And then you have like these, oh, you know, like, hold on one second. This is a centrist, a centrist and things like that, and whatever. Don't do that.
I mean,
and
I
so,
disagree. I think you're selling yourself short a little bit. There's this amazing, if people aren't familiar, there's this amazing piece that Moses wrote a few years ago, I think, for Afripunk, about like platform censorship and how it hit sex workers, Black and brown sex workers specifically, and how these things trickle and roll out to like broader beyond that, and how those effects aren't thought of before they're rolled out. And that's, I mean, that is where I think the conversation needs to be had, right? Like, that's what needs to be before the decisions are made.
Yeah, I think more marginalized groups need to be involved in the policy making. also don't agree with the practice of lobbying and like basically paying for the laws that you want. And so like, I don't know, like I don't have, I guess like right now I don't have full complete thoughts, but I will say that I think that there's this dichotomy or dichotomous line drawn between like white supremacists and then like everybody else, and it's just really not that simple, because there have been a lot of policies that have been made that have harmed my community, which is the broader Black community, which includes a lot of queer and trans people, especially like if we're talking about the LGBTQ community specifically. There was a lot of back and forth and debate over marriage equality being the centerpiece of the movement and who that would benefit.
Right.
And it turns out that the people who were dissenting were correct, and that it allowed white gay men to assimilate in a certain kind of way and to gain political power and to become white gay Republicans in some cases. And everyone else was just kind of left in, you know, this in-between space where sometimes they can benefit and a lot of the time they cannot.
Yeah. I also think that corporations, when given this kind of power, they have a tendency of creating a sort of like an arbitrary balance where they're like, oh, okay, like, you know, whenever, and there's a specific example that I have, which is whenever Facebook cracked down on militia groups, right? Which a number of people were calling for right-wing militia groups after the 1/6 attacks to be taken down. And a number of people who advocated for self-defense for trans people in the cities in particular were also taken down. And so it was like a both sides sort of balance, like, oh, okay, like if we have to take down right-wing, you know, groups that advocate for, you know, self-defense, using firearms or other means, then we also, on the other hand, we also have to you know, take down trans people who simply are providing information about pepper spray, not even like firearms. So we saw that happen, like and you know, it was a small number. It was maybe a 300 to 30 ratio. You know, it was like a 30 to 3 ratio, which I guess is 10 to 1 ratio in my head. That's my math in my head. But you know, these sort of consequences seem to happen a lot whenever it comes from the corporations, because there's a sort of balance an arbitrary balance that they generate in their minds and in their policy decisions.
I think so. Oh, go ahead.
We lost Hadi for dropped off. He's been censored, but I think he's coming back shortly. But I think now's a good time for us to segue over to our Q&A. We've been collecting some questions on Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, etc., and I've got a few gathered here that I'll pick and throw at y'all. And please feel free to answer if you feel so compelled. We've got one from Sam Park on Periscope that asks, would legislation be preferable to corporate policy on content moderation / user protection?
It's not going to happen. They have their the corporate lobbyists are too powerful and they have too much money thrown at it. So, you know, the question is, would legislation be better? It may be a better process in terms of like, you have public discourse, you have a record, but in terms of like the lobbying, the sheer lobbying force, I don't think that legislation in this area will happen. I just don't think it's a realistic. I don't think it's a realistic goal. So I think that what's happening here. Is that policies are being generated by corporations because of broad movements to undercut, you know, their to undercut their image, or, you know, outcry or brand, you know, harm to their brand from boycotts and protests and whatnot. And I still think that, you know, I mean, there's no good answers here. It's all.
Unfortunately, yeah. That's usually how it works, right? Well, okay, let's move on to a different one. We've got one from U039B. on Twitch. That first starts with, hi from France. I have a question. Do you think that the free software community has to create/invent new licenses? Great question here. New licenses, including restrictions on the usages of the software to prevent things like free software being used by oppressive groups or companies.
This is an ongoing debate in the open source community right now. There are measures that are being taken toward this. If you look up ethical source, I believe there are people working on that. I have some logistical questions about it personally, but I think that that is a thing that people are thinking about, that some folks are working on, and that is not at all settled. So if there are thoughts that you have on that, open source is open source. Come get involved, come contribute, and help us figure it out.
Yeah, I think I've actually had conversations with Ian about this in particular, which is, you know, the sort of like adding something to adding some form of licensing that is more than copyleft. You know, it's not just that you can't share, and it's not just that you could. It's not just a restriction on not being able to share information anymore, but being able to put into code licensing restrictions on using it for actively harmful things. And how do you and I think the biggest problem with that debate is that if somebody takes the code and puts it into proprietary software, at what point, you know, when will you ever know that, you know, that this code is being used in this harmful manner? And I think that's sort of the limitation of having a licensing thing. However, it does come to light, then there is the possibility of, you know, civil action or forcing them to close down or whatnot. So, you know, I think it's an open debate, and I think that there's a lot of issues with that that are unresolved.
You also have the question of what constitutes harm, which is not necessarily something that there's consensus on.
No.
Great points. Yeah, I wish there were an easy answer for that. We're having similar conversations over in open source projects here at EFF.
Hey, welcome back.
Hey, Hadi. Sorry you're having some difficulties. Welcome back.
So sorry, I was kicked out by Firefox.
Firefox is censoring you, and I'm so sorry that that's happening. Someone like them. Mozilla's usually so nice. Okay, I'm kind of skipping around in like the Q&A section here. We've got another one here from Ruby Red Xanadu on Twitch. It's a fabulous name. What's the most important lesson for us to pass on to the next generation of queer people getting involved in the digital realm?
That's a question. Wow.
Right.
This could go any number of directions. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Listen, it's something exceptional is happening actually in the Middle East and North Africa region, where very young queer people are using social media and the internet actually to express themselves on social media through visuals, through posts, through any other expression. And it's beautiful because it's creating their own visibility, and therefore it's creating the proper perception of what it means to be queer, with and through queer people ourselves. And this is a fascinating thing. This new generation, this new wave of queer activism is online for sure. And with this, again, comes this responsibility of knowing how to navigate the internet, how to navigate digital security. And this is the most important thing that we need to pass on to our next generation. How to be safe online, how to engage with trolling, because let's face it, LGBTQ+ people we're much more subjected to attacks and trolling than others. Our safety and privacy lines are, of course, which creates liabilities, and by protecting our digital civil liberties, we can only ensure that the online space where we exist, we are free, and and people are accountable in it. So yeah.
I'm actually going to be a sort of cranky old man for a minute and say that I think it's actually really important to teach young people who are just getting involved in the digital realm that offline is also important, and that it's important to be able to know how to organize in real life if they don't have the internet platforms that they're used to. It's important to know how to connect with one another in real life for any number of reasons. It's important to remember that there is a world outside of the internet sometimes, because I think it can be really easy to live in these bubbles. And like, if these things get taken away from us, because if going back a bit and calling back to talking about corporate content policies, if these platforms get taken away, where do we go from there? I think it's important for young folks to have an answer for that, because those of us who are a little older can remember a time without the internet, but young folks who are growing up with it don't, because they can't. And so knowing how to navigate without that, I think, is actually an important thing for them to know.
That's a great point.
For new people that enter into particularly the security and the digital realm space, like in terms of jobs, my advice would be to beware of the fact that historically queer and trans people in these spaces have been disposable, and that, you know, I think that there is a very real churn of queer and trans people who end up in these large corporate, you know, in these large corporations, who whenever the corporations like Google or Microsoft have some difficulty or have some problems internally, like it is the first people who seem to end up getting laid off or end up getting into trouble with, where other people would normally get a pass, tend to be minority groups, and that's across the board. That's not just queer and trans. That's immigrants. That's that's people of color. People who have different backgrounds and being white and male have a tendency of being first up on the chopping block. And so protect yourself from that, and figure out like ways of organizing in your space that are not dependent upon HR, unionizing, knowing your rights, etc. whenever it comes to working in these spaces. So, because I think there's a value in having people in these spaces, but also that value comes with an enormous amount of risk.
I think that when we talk about like the digital space versus like away from the keyboard, I think we have to be careful not to reinforce like that kind of like binary between the two things, or like, I guess like the digital dualism or whatever. And I do think too that a lot of the assumptions that youth are not aware of the world outside of the internet, or that they need extra lessons and everything like that, it's very class specific and sometimes race specific, because having watched the news my entire life, like I'm hyper aware as a Black person, as a Black queer person, like of the world around me, and the way that the dangers of like revealing too much or something on the internet. I know so many people in my community who worry about their kids being on the internet, who take precautions, who are like, don't get on there and say this and that, and don't put pictures of this and that, or don't put pictures of their kids at all. And so I think that we have to I think that in order to get to the root of a lot of these issues, we have to like question some of our assumptions about youth and about like what they know and don't know. I know that when I was a kid, it was assumed that, like I didn't think about certain things regarding safety or whatever. And it is true that youth are less experienced, and when you're less experienced, you're more likely to take risks. However, there are a lot of youth who are immigrants, who are Black, who are queer and trans and have been homeless, who are very much aware of the outside world and have had to organize on a micro level on their own, who have, like there's a lot of like, especially with like trans women, trans girls in particular, being out on, if they're put out of their home and whatever, they have to figure out how to create their own structured family and chosen, loved ones in order to survive if they're, if you're street-based and whatever, because there's a lot of shelters that will not take them. There's a lot of shelters that do not, there's not a lot of shelters available to youth males. There's not a lot of shelters that are available to trans people. There's just not a lot of resources available. And so they've had to organize and they've had to do those things. A lot of Black people and Latinos or Latinas, you know, they grow up in the church and they learn how to organize there. That's where I learned how to organize a lot of different things, events, protests, all of that, because it runs through that, because we've always had to. And so our youth are hyper aware. And I don't think that in, you know, non-white communities, especially in queer and trans communities, especially, that that those youth are as distant from their ancestors and from their elders as other groups might be, because we have always had to reach back in order to survive. And we have always had to think of time not in a linear way, but in a circular way, because history is always repeating itself. And really, when it comes down to it, when we think about who's first on the chopping block, it's going to be Black and immigrant, queer and trans people. It's going to be Black people across the board. And statistically, that shows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You made such a great point there about like how like we can't draw like rigid boundaries, right, between AFK and online, right?
Yeah. I've encountered this like personally, where I've had older people, you know, not even just that much older, like tell me like to go and touch grass because I'm online, and I'm like literally, and they say this while I'm in the park laying in the grass, like, you know, there's like your talk, like the communication boundaries, like I mean, we live in people who can be extremely online and still be very cognizant and aware of the entire world and have a life off the internet. So I think that is a stereotype. There's a generational stereotype that's being like conveyed through mass media that I think is I think damaging and harmful.
I want to apologize because I think that I was trying to make a more nuanced point that I think failed to come across, and genuine apologies for that, because I didn't mean to stereotype you in that way.
No, I didn't pick that up. I didn't pick that up at all.
I feel like altogether, all the points that you all have brought up through this is just about like how there isn't like a rigid distinction between the online or off, and how the two inform each other. And the more aware that we are of it, the more powerful we can be in our organizing and advocacy for ourselves and for each other. There's another question that came up in the chat. It could be a good one to maybe start wrapping up with before you say some goodbyes and, you know, plug our things. Could be a trolling question. It's worth talking about. Someone asked, why is it only, I think the stream here, why is it only focused on LGBTQ+++? Doesn't everyone's freedom matter?
Yes, everyone's freedom matters.
And precisely this is why we are talking about LGBT people, because everybody's freedom matters, including the LGBT.
No, it doesn't matter. Their freedom doesn't matter.
It's also Pride Month, and it's the Pride panel, so I think that's why we're talking about the gays today.
I think that this is a funny question, because, and it's total shade, complete and utter abominable shade to the person who wrote this question, just because like this is the title of the panel and what it is, but also because I've been writing this piece on the politics of victimhood and how we're like, specifically I've been focusing on the Black community and the gender wars that continuously happen, and this idea that it's almost like a relationship, right? It's like, well, you did this and you did this, and sometimes what one person did is worse than what the other person did, right? You know, but like sometimes we all have our parts to play, and sometimes we just need to hear each other out, and sometimes, you know what I'm saying? So it's very complicated, right? And to ask, you know, a question like, doesn't everyone's freedom matter? It's a very tricky question, right? Because, you know, some people want the freedom to murder people. Like, some people want the freedom to drop bombs on other people's countries. Some people want the freedom to enslave people. Some people want the freedom to tell people what they can and cannot do outside of work. So it depends on what you mean by freedom. What do you, you know, like, what is liberation to you? Because, you know, liberation to me might not look the same, or liberation to certain groups might not look the same.
Exactly. Yeah. And if we don't hone in on the specific points on it, like the LGBTQ+ community, how are we going to get anywhere? Whether or not that question was in good faith or not, I'm happy to bring it here. And thank you all for answering it.
At George Floyd Square, we have 4 stated assumptions that get stated at the beginning of every meeting, and I'm not going to speak to all 4, but I will say that one of them is assume that not everybody here has your idea of liberation in mind, which I think is an incredibly useful ground rule because it accounts both for people having differing ideas and for people who are there for various kind of perhaps untoward purposes. And the idea is assume that, act accordingly. So if we all assume that we don't all have the same idea of liberation in mind, we can all learn about each other's idea of liberation and what makes sense and what doesn't, and also we can act accordingly. So it covers both threat models and learning about each other.
My idea of liberation is that I shouldn't have to wear a mask when I go to the
definitely not the same idea of liberation in mind.
It's the most important issue. I'm kidding.
Well, we only have a few minutes left before I'm going to cut you all off and say goodbye. But I would like to give you all an opportunity. Well, first, let me say thank you all for joining us here. Thank you all, everyone out there watching, for tuning in to this EFF at Home conversation. And thank you, Moses, Chelsea, Hadi, Ian. You're all so wonderful. It's so lovely to see you all gathered here in this this square. Is there anything that you would like to plug or where we can find you online?
You can find me thotscholar on Twitter. That's basically the only place I am.
Excellent Twitter account.
You can find me at Ian Coldwater on Twitter. For plugging things, I want to say if you're not paying attention to what's happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the USA right now, there's a lot going on with ongoing responses to police killings, not limited to George Floyd. There have been multiple people killed by the police and somebody killed by a white supremacist just in the last couple of weeks. So please pay attention to what's going on there. It's really important because that kind of thing is a canary that might eventually come to affect you too.
Thank you. Chelsea, anything you want to plug?
All right, yeah. So I know that we've done a lot of serious topics. I do a lot of not serious things. For me, I have a Twitter account, XYChelsea. I have a Twitch account where I stream video games, mostly educational, and I try to have some kind of educational element to it. I don't necessarily talk about politics. That is twitch.tv/XYChelsea87. I'm also starting a YouTube series on science and technology, and particularly focusing on tech issues. Like just educational stuff like Bill Nye the Science Guy. In particular, I'm focusing my first 2 videos on cryptocurrency, and I'm already starting work on my second video, which is on artificial intelligence.
That's great. I can't wait to see them.
Yeah.
Hadi,
and I'm on Patreon. So patreon.com/XYChelsea. That's my main source of income right now.
Nice.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm on Patreon too. It's just /thotscholar. I totally always forget about my Patreon.
Thank you for letting us know. Yeah, if anyone out there is watching and appreciating the work and the words you've heard today, please go there and pay our fine folks. Hit them. So it looks like Hadi dropped off. Again, he's being censored by Mozilla.org. But I guess I can maybe plug a little bit for him. I know you can find him on Twitter at Hadi Damien. Great Twitter account. He's actually back. Hadi, I was just about to plug for you, but if there's anything you'd like to say before we go where you can find you, please. Hadi?
Well, what's happening today is a sign that digital knowledge, know-how, and security and everything is instrumental, actually. Because literally, I've been kicked in, out like more than 4 times. It's just too weird, too embarrassing. So thank you for coping with me on this thing. So I'm also on Twitter, Hadi Damien. This is I'm not so much into social media, but I'm essentially on Twitter when it comes to this. So thanks for having me. the borders between the offline and the online are very porous. What happens online happens offline. What happens offline is also online. We can mobilize entire people at masses just by having some things going online. So it's quite a big responsibility. And this is a new ecosystem that we need to properly understand so we can navigate it, especially in our work, to improve people's realities, whoever they are, actually. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. That's a perfect note to end it on. So please follow everyone there. Go to EFF.org to learn more about us, and also you can donate to the organization there. Thank you all so much. Happy Pride Month. Talk to you all soon.
Happy Pride.